Maybe you're visiting with us, haven't been here with the series that we've done. We wrapped up a series on Daniel, and kind of dovetailing on that, if you look at Daniel and you look at a lot of what is being taught there, it goes really well and kind of fits in really well with what then happens right after. This is kind of the rest of that story. So in the book of Daniel, we see all these kind of historical look-backs of how the Israelites were initially taken into captivity. There we go. Into captivity through Nebuchadnezzar's reign as the Babylonian. And then after a couple leaders go through, you end up getting them released back out of captivity as God had promised and told through the prophet Jeremiah that they're going to be allowed to go back. And so we looked at a few things in there, and we've been really focusing on how God was at work during this entire time. So I want to back up. We did get into the first few verses of Ezra 4 last time, but I do want to back up to the beginning in chapter 4, verse 1. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." We talked a little bit about this last time, that they're just lying. They did not care. They wanted the glory. They had no intention of this. They are not telling the truth. They're being deceitful to try to get to be brought in to be part of the building team, because they don't want these people to build something and gain any kind of clout or stronghold in a land that has kind of passed hands back over now to all these pagans that have moved into this area, whether they're they're all the ites. I would say that. You can list off all the different ites of all the different, the Edomites, the Aramites, all those ites. All these groups of people who have lived in this land, they all end up back here. And so now you've got the Israelites being allowed to come back to this land, and they went in on this building process. And they said, well, we've been seeking your God. We've been sacrificing to him, which is interesting because the chapter right before it, in chapter 3, if you remember, what was the one big thing that was being built? The altar. How were they sacrificing without the altar to God? Not sure how they figured that out. How were they sacrificing without the altar and all the priests living in either Susa or in Babylon? And so there was all these issues of deceitful speech here. So it says, but Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. He did not ask you to do it. He told us to go. He sent us back. He said that we were going to be the ones to do the building here." Josh is going to read for us this chapter 4, verse 4. So Josh, if you're ready. All right, Josh, thanks. So again, they wanted to just discourage them. They set out, these people who were so wholeheartedly wanting to worship God that they wanted to work side by side with them. It's like, no, you don't get to work. Well, fine. You can kind of see the childish fit they start throwing here. They decide they're going to go about and just completely try to frustrate the plans. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right, so what does that mean? Well, a little history here. So here's where the Achaemenid or the Medo-Persian Empire, the leaders there, you have Cyrus, who's the one that issues the edict. And remember, there's something really important about a Medo-Persian edict. Once it's in writing, it's there. Not even Cyrus would have been able to take this back and undo it. Once it's in writing, it's set in writing, which, by the way, is a big deal during the same time period because as we kind of see other instances that becoming in writing is a really important issue that comes up. Cambyses II is next, very short period of time. Bardiya only lasts for a very small period of time. And then Darius I who I don't believe is the Darius that's going to be talked about here, because then we have Xerxes from 485 to 465, Artaxerxes, and a lot of your scripture will be referred to as Ahasuerus. You might remember that name from the book of Esther. Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes was the one that was throwing the big thing. Queen Vashti decided she wasn't going to come dance for all of his friends. He gets a little mad, does away with Queen Vashti. Vashti's gone. He's searching for a queen. And luckily, beautiful Esther becomes queen because Medo-Persian rules can't be unwritten. And once it's set in stone, it's set in stone. Haman, you'll remember, a quick little sidestep the whole book of Esther here for a second. Haman decides he doesn't like the Jews because Mordecai, Esther's uncle, is sitting out by the town gate, and he's refusing to bow down and give Haman, who's third in command, all of this glory. And he's like, well, I want him to, don't you know who I am kind of a person. And so he goes and finds a way to have a date set aside that they get to annihilate and wipe out the Jews because they're a scourge to this empire. And Artaxerxes, whose wife is a Jew, he doesn't realize it, writes an edict that's going to wipe them all out. So then they come up with another plan that says, okay, but we get to fight back. So then that has to be written in a rule because he can't even take it back. He can't stop the rule he put into place. So they put another one in place that says, and they get to fight back for 2 days. So you really want to go at them? Because they're going to get 2 opportunities to do it. And so that's how Queen Esther was able to essentially save the Jewish people during the time of Artaxerxes because of, again, the same issue of once it's written down, it's set. All right, big deal there. All right, so then we have finally, after Artaxerxes, Darius II. During this entire time, they are constantly fighting against him, constantly trying to frustrate the plans during this entire window of time. From Cyrus down 7 leaders later to Darius II. That's what was being referenced there in Ezra. All right, so at the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, so we're in this window of all these, between Cyrus and Darius II, you've got Xerxes. At the beginning of his reign, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. Remember, Artaxerxes for a while was not married to Esther. We don't, and this is probably while he was still married to Queen Vashti. It's a speculation there, whether or not it's probably prior to at least the incident with Haman, because after that he becomes a little bit more favorable to the Jews. This would have been prior to that when he doesn't have this strong, high regard of the Jews. And so Artaxerxes was written to him in the Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes the king as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurbanipal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. It's a long intro. That's a hello. Here's who's writing all this. All these people are writing it. All right. This is the copy of the letter they sent to him. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates. Could have just set up there. That was a really long intro to get to that part. All right, the king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. So when you can't stop their plans and you can't frustrate them, and after a while you can't scare them enough, you go to the leader of the people and you go to Artaxerxes, jump all the way up to the top, and say, you realize what they're doing. They're rebuilding Jerusalem. You may not be familiar with Jerusalem, but look back at its history. It is rebellious and wicked. And so furthermore, the king should know that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid. And eventually, the royal revenues will suffer. All right, you want to talk to the king, talk to him about his treasury suffering. They knew exactly how to get his ear. You're going to lose money out of this. They're going to rebel against you, and they're not going to pay you what they owe you. And so now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it's not proper for us to see the king dishonored, they take their hatred of the Israelites completely out of the picture. Why are they doing this? Artaxerxes, don't want to see you lose some money on this deal. It's our duty to stop you from having this happen to you. And again, they're obviously being very insidious in how they're sending this letter. All right, so because it's not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we're sending this message to inform the king so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. Sadly, that's true. Okay, so they actually have a pretty good statement there. If you look back in the history of Jerusalem, it's going to kind of not look good. On paper, Jerusalem to these kings probably looked pretty rebellious. They always had their own king. They always had their own religion. They always had issues that were going on. I mean, Jerusalem was conquered, fought over, rebuilt, destroyed time and time and time again. So the fact that this city has had a little bit of a history of fighting is probably going to show up in the records. And the fact that they had to come get rid of it when, because of God's doing, having Nebuchadnezzar come and cart them away, there was a lot of destruction that took place during that time. That's going to be in the record books. So they knew, if you look it up, we can find some things that are going to make Jerusalem look really bad. All right, that is why this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. The king sent this reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of their associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order, and a search was made, and it was found that the city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. And they're sitting there thinking like, aha, we knew it. We knew they'd find it because it's there. The proof is there. Jerusalem has had a really long history of all of this. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. So, now issue an order to these men to stop work so that the city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let the threat grow to the detriment of the royal interest? So in other words, all right, just put a pause on it. He doesn't put a stop to it. He puts a pause on it. Just say, okay, we need to get to the bottom of this. The taxes were being paid. The tributes were being paid. But they had a whole lot of revolt going on. And so it's like, all right, just put a pause, make them stop working right now, and I want to make sure this doesn't hurt my kingdom. And so as soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately. They're not going to waste any time. This is like, aha, I've got my... They probably ran. I mean, quite honestly, this is what they've been wanting for a while. They went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right. So again, that's why I said that we know it's going to be all the way down to Darius too, because this is happening with Artaxerxes. The next one after Artaxerxes is Darius. So for several years' time, just from one king to the next, it's not several kings on this one. Artaxerxes was king 6. Darius 2 is king 7, so they're right after each other. But during that window of time, everything comes to a standstill, and the work stops. Now, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, we're up to chapter 5 now, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were there with them, supporting them. At that time, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates went to them and asked, who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it? All right, I'm going to stop right there for a second. Does it seem like all of a sudden things got out of order? They did. We jumped time. Don't miss that in Ezra chapter 5. We just went back. What were they talking about in chapter 4? If I went back, if you just want to flip back, I won't go back on the slides. If you go back to that talking about what happens later during Xerxes and Artaxerxes, we'll get to that in Nehemiah. That is kind of a foreshadowing of other events that also related to this whole issue. It was an aside or a soliloquy off to the side for several verses talking about an event in the future about because this is written after all these events have taken place. And so in hindsight, while talking about this issue of the rebuilding of the temple, he goes back and says, they fought us even when we were trying to rebuild the city, too. This continued all the way down to the time that Darius was king. So now we're back toward the earlier stretch of this. Cyrus is out of the picture. We're in that earlier half of these kings. Tatnai is governor, not Shimshai. So now we've gone back to a different one. So again, don't lose sight of, it was kind of a looking ahead, these things are, happened too, and now we're back to the storyline. All right, so that's where we are. So at that time, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates went to them and asked, who authorized you to rebuild this temple? Remember, that's the first thing that gets rebuilt, not the city and its walls. That's later. So they asked, what are the names of those who are constructing this building? But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply could be received. Okay, here's where it gets confusing. There's two Dariuses. So that's why there's a little question mark hanging over that one. And that's probably where it gets the most confusing. All right, so this is a copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates, the officials of Trans-Euphrates, sent to King Darius. The report they sent him read as follows. To King Darius, cordial greetings. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah, to the temple of the great God. The people are building it with large stones and placing the timbers in the walls. The work is being carried on with diligence and is making rapid progress under their direction. We questioned the elders and asked them, who authorized you to rebuild this temple and finish it? We also asked them their names so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. That's not really why. We can all see through that one, right? All right, so this is the answer they gave us. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. That goes back to Daniel chapter 1 then, as we kind of get back on a timeline look of it. That was events that were taking place prior to the Babylonian captivity. They had built this they built this temple under Solomon, and during this time they used it. Of course, they go bad king, back and forth, divided kingdom with two bad kings going side by side. And eventually, they just got so far gone that God uses Nebuchadnezzar to bring them into captivity. But God wants his people to go back. And so this is kind of that storyline of how this happens. However, now we're at the end of the book of Daniel. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. He even removed from the temple of Babylon the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to the temple in Babylon, and inadvertently had put them in storage for 70 years for Israel. He didn't realize what he had actually done, but he protected them and saved them because God had him do that. Then King Cyrus gave them to a man named Sheshbazzar. You may remember that from the earlier part of this book. Sheshbazzar was the one that was given all those articles. He's the one that brings back the first group of exiles. And so whom he appointed governor, and he told them, take these articles and go deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem and rebuild the house of God on its site. That was the command from Cyrus. So this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. From that day to the present, it has been under construction, but is not yet finished. Now, if it pleases the king, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter. All right, so King Darius then issues an order, and they searched the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. A scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. So the proof was there. Here's the thing. Once it's written down, don't lose sight of this. If this scroll that he's about to read says what the Jews are claiming that it says, then all these plans to frustrate the building of the temple can't be going on. And so, on this memorandum, in the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Actually, before we read this, I want to read this in just a second. Why do you remember, what was the reasoning behind? And again, it's always easy when this isn't a room with lower ceiling and everything. It's easy just, this is class. Feel free to jump in and throw out your thoughts and questions if you have any along the way. Why was it that this decree was written in the first year of King Cyrus? What was it that motivated him? Obviously God, but what events did God use to motivate him to write this? Do you remember what had just happened? What was the last big event that took place in the book of Daniel as far as big, there was a lot of prophecy toward the end, but what was the last big event that took place? Writing on the wall was getting close to the end. That was under Belshazzar, though. So then we still have another king that comes in after Belshazzar. We have Darius, the Mede, who was probably not that big of a king at the time that Cyrus was actually the king. So some people think Darius and Cyrus are the same guy. Others will say that Darius the Mede was kind of like there was a Medo-Persian empire. They had side-by-side kings. Cyrus was a Persian, and he was the more, kind of the bigger leader, and ends up taking full control over that. But what was it that had happened in Daniel's life that really, particularly with Darius, was an issue? The lion's den story, that's right. So that was how God used him, because he tore the heart out of Darius, thinking that he had been tricked into killing Daniel. And afterward, his heart was moved so that Daniel was put into a position of great esteem and even more, high regard, so that Cyrus then wants to send his people back. That was how God utilized this, got it into writing. And I said then when we were looking over it, that's more important than it's going to look like. Because once you get into Ezra, you see why it was so critical. And God knew this, that God knew that if I can get Cyrus to put it into writing, my people will build the house of God, no matter what people do to try to stop them. Because quite honestly, they were outnumbered. If there was nothing legally to give them the right to do it, the people would have warred them, waged war against them to the point where they couldn't have done it. But this is what really, essentially saves them. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. That happened. The other part was starting to be happened with the paying out of the royal treasury. And over the years, the king stopped making payment. And so they were no longer having that supply of money coming out of the royal treasury. But here it is in writing. Once you know it, you got to follow it here. And so this is what the king is going to essentially issue there. So now then, Tatnai, you who wrote me this letter in hopes of stopping them from doing everything, governor of Trans-Euphrates and Shethar-Bozenai and all the other officials of the province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. And so again, this direction was given then, that as we continue to see this, that all of a sudden now you've got this group that has been wanting nothing more than to stop this from happening. They want nothing more than to put an end to the work of the Jews in rebuilding this. What's really bothering them about this is that these are the people who, as we kind of talked about, moved back into a land that was their land. They don't call it Judah. They call it Trans-Euphrates now. It has this name of and they've got governors over Trans-Euphrates. This isn't their land, it's our land. That's kind of the Tatnai and the Shethar-Bozenai is kind of, look at it this is our land. We got to find a way to stop him. Let's go to the highest authority here. Let's go to the king. And we'll make sure that, he's got control of it. Well, the response there from Darius wasn't exactly what they'd hoped for. So, as it continues, moreover, so it goes beyond that. I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. So it gets worse. So now he's issuing a decree. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates so that the work will not stop. So guess what? You're paying the bill now. It's like, you tried to trick me. I think he saw through their plan, so much so that he turns the tables on them and says, now you're going to have to, out of your revenues, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifice pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. In other words, I went back and he probably saw more than just this writing. He probably realized what all happened during that time. He became keenly aware of the fact that he wants this God on his side. He does not want to pit himself against God. And this is not the same Darius of the Lion's Den Darius. So, that was a different Darius. There is possibly up to 3 Dariuses in this mix that we're looking at. And so Darius the Mede and then Darius 1 and 2 are all 3 different people. And so this is most likely Darius 1. I say that it's possible that it's Darius 2. The reason why you kind of lean against that a little bit and that there was a jump in time and come back is because it's the temple being rebuilt specifically, which was a little bit earlier. Darius 2 would have been during the time of the city being rebuilt, and the city walls, which comes up in Nehemiah about the temple's there and the city looks terrible. And it's kind of an issue that, the temple's been rebuilt and it sits amongst rubble. That it looks bad. And that's going to be an issue coming up of Nehemiah. But everything they could possibly need. It went beyond just pay for the lumber, pay for the stones, and leave them alone. It became into now every single day, whatever they want, you go get it for them and pay for it out of your own governorship's money. So I can imagine, remember how the last group had their letter and run there to put a stop to it. They get their letter, and it's not quite so good for them. Goes on. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they're to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or destroy this temple in Jerusalem. This is not God talking. This is Darius. This is Darius, the Persian king. Looking at this saying, I don't want to mess with the wrath that this God has capable within him. I don't even want to go there. I don't want any part of that. All I want is to make sure that we stay on his good side, that we follow this decree. And if one of you dares to try to break this, because he's thinking, I want my family and my kingship to be held. He, I think, realizes that God deposes kings when he wants them deposed and puts them into, he's like, I'm not walking that line. I will impale any one of you on one of your own house beams and turn your house into a pile of rubble if you don't do this. And it was more threat probably, and not that he wouldn't have carried it out, but it was just more to elevate there's punishment if you don't do this. It's not just, I want you to do this every single day and take care of them, but it's under penalty of death if you don't. That's how serious he was about making sure this got carried out. Kind of interesting. Not exactly the letter they expected to receive in return. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. He decreed it. It's set. Boom. In stone. Can't be changed. Now, how did God get his temple rebuilt? There you have it. He made sure. And interesting, the Persians paid for it. There are other references you could probably jump to that would be political, and I won't go there. But it's kind of that whole kind of funny thing of the irony of this kind of idea. It's like, we're going to build a temple, and the Persians are going to pay for it. So it's this kind of idea that's how it got done. God used that. He used the Persians to pay their bills. He did this, and it's amazing that he was able to get that to accomplish that way. I don't have any more up on the slides, but I want to continue on because the story continues. So again, I was getting a lot of slides, and I thought, well, I didn't know for sure if we'd make it to the end of chapter 6, but it looks like we will. So, chapter 6, starting in verse 13. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Now, this is where it gets confusing of which Darius for sure was writing it. It looks like now we see the full timeline. During the Darius 1 is the one who did the decree. And then again, we know what happens when the other guys try to stop it, when you get the Shimshai and his group try to stop it during the days of Artaxerxes, and it goes all the way down into the days of King Darius. And that point, 6 years into his reign, we're able to see that they finally get this completed. Then, verse 16, then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. Why did they ever go to Babylon? What was the reasoning and the rationale that's most likely, when you read Scripture, and I think we're told multiple times, summarize it. Why'd they end up in Babylon? Because they messed up, and God had to get them back on track. They had sinned, they had angered God in their rebellion, they had done too many things, and they tried to get a little too chummy with Egypt, which he said, absolutely not. Egypt will lead you away from me. I do not want you messing with Egypt. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And guess what they did? Okay, well, we're going to go play with Egypt. So he's like, quit doing that. He gave them warning after warning after warning. And finally, he said, all right, Nebuchadnezzar, go take them. And store all my stuff while you're at it. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't see it that way. He thinks, I'm taking over more land. And then God uses all of that through the book of Daniel. Gets us all the way to where it's written, write it down. Boom, set in stone. I'm getting my temple back for my people, and you're paying for it. And sure enough, time and time again, every time they tried to stop it, proof it was written down in stone. He used it in empire. You would think that that's such a strange rule to have in place, that the kings can't even undo their own writing. Like, that is a very strange and unusual policy that not every kingdom would have had, but they did. And so it was set, and nothing could be done to undo it. So because of that, we end up seeing kind of the whole story play itself out, which is God utilized what was going on in the world history of that time to steer his people through a training period of time to realize they needed to get back on track. Did it work? Oh, it sounds like it. I mean, it sounds like they put all these and installed these priests and put everyone in there according to what is written in the book of Moses. What was life like prior to them going to Babylon? During the days of Josiah, one of the kings, one of the rare good kings, prior to the Babylonian captivity, do you remember the most astounding story that happens during the king Josiah's reign? They're cleaning up in the temple. What do they find? They found these books. They weren't, how were they? They didn't even know where they were for almost 70 years. They didn't know where they were. They dust them off and they're like, look at this. We're not doing any of this stuff. What were they doing? What was religion looking like to them? How were they serving God? Well, go back a few years prior to that. What was it like under the days of Eli, the high priest? Well, it was pretty clear, that picture that's painted out there in 1 Samuel and other passages through there where you can see this depiction of life that was horrendous. The worship was including every form of pagan prostitution, idol worship, everything being brought into God's temple. It was through brute force that they would take people's sacrifices from them. They would take these things away, and they would the best portions of it, or they would kind of manhandle the people as they came in, and you're going to give the priests the best stuff, aren't you? And so much so that Eli was getting fatter and fatter and fatter, and ultimately died of his own weight issue because of how much he stole from the people. When he tips over in his chair, breaks his neck because they'd taken the Ark of the Covenant and used it as a good luck charm. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that was going on prior to the book of Daniel. So when God needs to have them whipped into shape, he uses Nebuchadnezzar. And the Babylonian kingdom alone wouldn't have been able to do that because their writings can be changed. But the Medo-Persians get to take over control because they're the ones whose laws allow for this to play itself out exactly the way God wanted to. But what we see here is that it seemed to have done the trick, that it seemed to have done the job that God always knew that it would, that he was going to bring his people back home, that he was going to bring them back home. They'd be changed. They'd be more lined up with what God had wanted them to. And as we read the last few verses of chapter 6, on the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and the Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Now, I did jump back all the way on that one to explain what they did very first and foremost when they first got there, back to that first 14th day of the first month. But they celebrated the fact that Cyrus did this, because the fact that he let them go back and wrote it down. So importantly, we see now all of those things of why it plays itself out. So the timeline in Ezra is admittedly all over the place. I mean, it really is, because it's telling this story. It's not trying to be a chronological textbook on there. So sometimes you have to keep putting yourself into the overall timeline and seeing where this fits in, and it all starts making sense. They're just recounting a story of how all of this played out and how God cared for them, and they'll tell it all the way through, and then they'll jump back to a different kind of part of the story. And so we kind of jump around on time here. But all of this is happening between Cyrus and Darius too. That, at the very least, is the easiest part to understand. With that in mind, does anybody have any questions over these three? Yeah.
So with all these dates and names, Matt, were they without a temple just 70 years?
So at least 70 years. It wasn't 70 years to the day, because remember, they were without an altar for at least 70 years. The very first thing they did when they got back there, year one, was build the altar. So they had a form of ways to do sacrificing after about 70 years when they get back to Jerusalem. The rebuilding of the house of God to surround that takes many, many more years, almost another 50 to 100 years of building, and frustrations along the way and everything going against them. So they were without a temple, a full temple, for probably closer to 150, 170 years. Because they're carted off in 586 BC, and now we're not getting into Darius' time until about 420 BC, and so you're looking at a pretty lengthy time, 150 plus years before it's completed, from completed temple to completed temple. But there was worship going on after they got back, shortly after 70 years. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't know that it's a question, but it just seems like you can see God's providence and working. The people that had a written law that couldn't be changed wasn't the first rulers, but the second rulers. And God will punish us severely if we don't do it, but He'll protect us greatly if we pay attention.
Yeah.
I mean, just that alone should get us. We talk about grace and mercy. Okay, granted, it took, after the 70 years, it took a while to get the temple completely built, but that's allowing them a chance to get their act together and really, are you going to be serious about being good Jews?
The other thing I think it's also good to point out on that too is that during that whole time frame when all that's happening, and you've got all these people who are who are coming back into that land through these different times. The fact that God ahead of time knew how to get his people back in a way that would allow this to happen the right way, and that he got his temple rebuilt, if anything, how does that not then go back and give us more certainty of all of those prophecies that we read about in the book of Daniel? Like I said, the interesting thing when we were studying Daniel was there are some people who try to date Daniel so much later in time so that they don't have to accept the fact that God can see into the future. I guess it's kind of the reasoning, but there's no matter how late you put it, you still get it partially into prophecy, right? And we kind of talked about that. But why then is it hard to believe that a God who can take his people into a captivity for his purpose to train them to be better and find a good way to get them back and rebuilt basically better than they were before, because now they don't have kings over them, in that sense of their own kings, that they now have God as their king again and a functioning temple at the end of all this, that if he could see how to do all that, how is it so hard to believe that he knew that the Medo-Persians would be followed by the Greeks and the Greeks would be followed by the Romans? It seems like that's actually a lot simpler than what he actually did. He actually wove a series of events through world history, and not just knowing what was happening, he coursed it in such a way that it was going to happen that way. So I've always been astounded how many people who claim to be of a God-believing Christian faith that can't accept Daniel as written in the 500s BC, because there's just too much. There's no way that God would have known all that. It's like, okay, I'm not going to take away from God what he knows. He clearly knows that he could do a lot of pretty amazing things when it comes to the timeline stuff. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, we'll wrap it up there. We'll pick up at the next chapter, Ezra 7, next week.